Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm JP. Various other ways I get called or addressed are up on the screen. The choice of Jobsworth as my Twitter ID has absolutely nothing to do with any sort of view I have of the civil service. It was actually a code name that I used for a project to replace my desktops with Apple in a job some years ago, and I've just kept on with that name and everything else I do. When addressing something like this, one of the most important things I want to bear in mind and have all of you bear in mind is that it's a William Gibson quotation. The future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. So whatever I talk about, it isn't either a detraction or a criticism of what is already happening. And I am fairly well au fait with what has been happening in terms of the use of today's tools within the civil service. But rather than make that the focus of my discussion, I want to try to bring people back. In fact, another compute genius who I have a lot of time for, called Alan Kay, probably said more of what I want to express over here. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, he became famous, amongst other things, while working on the sort of the Windows interface that later came through. He said, in order to predict, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Okay? 30 years later, he was a fairly cynical, much older man. And having tried in large organizations to invent the future, he altered what he said and changed it to the best way to predict the future is to prevent it. And I think that is really the challenge that you face, that we face, about whether we want to predict the future by inventing it or by preventing it. That choice is there. A lot has already been done to open up the civil service, so what I wanted to talk about is almost a set of stories to try and explain why people use open platforms, how they work, what we should look for, what kind of outcomes are expected. I probably want to talk for about 40 minutes. I don't have a large number of slides. The slides don't have a large number of text. That's not my style at all. And then open up the last 20 minutes to questions. I've never addressed an audience of this sort, so forgive me if you find me trying to pitch it too low, too high, too anything, because the only thing that is true is I've tended to speak primarily either in financial circles or in sort of unconference circles around the web, and I've never addressed a group of civil servants in my life. So, first and foremost, I wanted to talk about airports. Okay? When people use phrases like open multi-sided platforms, they start conjuring up images to me of very little. Right? There's just so much theory. For my sins, I travel a lot. I travel so much. And this is despite taking as much care as I can of my carbon footprint. I even live near the airport because it gives me a chance to get home that little bit earlier. But if you take an airport just as an example of what an open multi-sided model would look like, because I want to embed the meaning of the phrase rather than talk through the theory. First and foremost, an airport is a place where a plane lands and takes off. It has a primary purpose. And if you're lucky, the field on which this happens is cordoned off by wire to prevent cows from grazing on the same sort of patch of grass. And there may be a hut for you to sort of take shelter in the event of rain or snow or intense heat. And I've been to many airports where that's all the airport is. I think the nearest airport I've seen of that kind of simplicity near the UK or within the general confines of the United Kingdom is in the Channel Islands in Alderney, where you take a plane and that's all you see. So the core existence of an airport is nothing more than a landing strip and a place to be able to embark and disembark. Then suddenly things happen. Right? If you start having scale, if you start scaling up on this, you need to have some ability for people to be able to go to more than one plane, because that wasn't there in the kind of primitive airports I was talking about. So you need some concept of being able to check in. If you move from that even further and say you allow people to take luggage on, then as soon as you have multiple planes, you're going to have some way of actually taking the luggage on and off the plane. If the planes aren't close by, you're going to start having some transportation needs to get to the aircraft. If you start getting enough of critical mass, suddenly you need security. If you start having the airport looking through as having international borders, an airside and greenside effect, suddenly you have immigration. And bit by bit, this tiny little thing called an airport, which had a single primary purpose of having a plane take off and land, has started having a series of other activities. And before you know it, you have shops, lounges, restaurants, places of worship, the kind of ecosystem that builds around it, which people like Tom Hanks have sort of made famous in films about people who managed to stay in airports a very long time. But you see how, if you take something as simple as an airport, you can layer it with service after service after service as you start, A, scaling up, B, changing the nature, and C, being able to provide other services to the participants as a result. And I think that's, there's a lot that we can learn ourselves from this in order to see how we apply this within the context of the civil service. So, let's look at some of these elements, one piece at a time. One of the first elements that has started changing in airports is the ability to personalize information. Right? It becomes absolutely critical if you want to be able to identify who you are and make sure that, whether you put your credit card in or an affinity card or a loyalty card or you scrape your passport or whatever else, if you're going to start getting service that is scalable in a model like an airport, you need to be able to identify who you are and get back something personalized. Right? Identity itself in the air appears to have different behaviors compared to on road and by sea. Right? I'm not here to question or debate why that is the case, but the facts remain that you have more rigorous identity checks for crossing barriers when you travel by air rather than by land or sea. And the airport copes with that. Right? Many of the services that we would want to put forward in an open multi-sided platform would need to have that. The second element is that of security, because suddenly when you have something that is of value and that creates a commons value, you need to be able to protect the common in order to have an avoidance of what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons, but which something, I'm much more interested in what Clay Shirky said about aspects of the commons. When talking about something completely apparently disconnected as wikis, and speaking on Wikipedia, Shirky made the point that in something like Wikipedia, the cost of repair is at least as low as the cost of damage. And as a result, the common good is preserved. When I try to explain that to people, I try to use examples like chewing gum and graffiti. If the cost of a stick of chewing gum is 3p and the cost of taking it off a pavement is 10p, the likely expectation is that chewing gum will grow like Topsy on a footpath, because the economics win over there. So if you want to have something that is protected as the commons, you've got to try and look at the cost of how to repair something. The same is true for graffiti. The cost of a tin of spray paint may be trivial in comparison with the cost of trying to restore that which has been sprayed to its previous glory, or at least to its previous condition, whatever it was. So when you build something that is an open platform, it is important to bear in mind that we have to take care of what the cost of repair is. And one of the ways of taking care of it is looking architecturally at the implications of security right at the start of building such a service. And I say that while bearing in mind that a lot of times we talk about openness at the same time as we talk about security, but I don't think of security as closeness, and I'll come to that point. Now, I've actually been at airports where all the luggage gets taken off a plane and gets thrown into a group on the ground, and you try and collect the bag that's yours as if you're in a rugby scrum. Okay? It is not enjoyable. In the UK, I've come close to it probably when traveling by coach. Sometimes the kind of melee that takes place as you try to put your luggage onto a coach and you try and take your luggage off a coach. You lose all the values of queuing or being patient or waiting as you see people almost cannibalize their way through to the luggage because they're in a hurry for whatever it is they do. Why do these things not happen at airports? Well, there's a good reason, because you had to develop something like the carousel to say we will have some logical way of having the luggage taken off a plane or put on a plane because you have conveyor belts. Those standards matter, the shape and size of the belts, the shape and size of the containers, the pallets onto which the luggage can be stored, or the trucks, the mini trucks onto which the luggage goes. Every one of these things is meaningful in trying to establish how you take the luggage in an airport and move it, right? And that luggage is nothing more than data as we start speaking about the context I want to come to. The same is again true for the kind of tool sets you use. Right? One of the more sort of enjoyable resources for looking at things like opening up any form of government, there's a site I visit regularly called resource.org. And in resource.org, one of the first things they did was to say, if one of the ways you can transform any form of civil service is to be able to take the data that is there and make it available, then it makes sense to start having some values and principles by which that data is actually exposed. And resource.org actually mentions 8 such values, which are worth bearing in mind. They're not complicated, saying make sure that the data that you're exposing is complete, make sure that it is accessible, ensure that it's timely, ensure that it is non-proprietary, ensure that there is no form of discrimination in how it is exposed, make sure that there is no special license due for it, and ensure that the way that it is exposed is machine readable. Okay? None of these is in itself rocket science, but expressing them as principles by which a body like you, in your various disparate forms, can look at the principles of how you would create the civil service to be open, multi-sided, a platform, relies on the right kind of standards and the right kinds of tool sets being made available. And this is not trivial, because if you use a proprietary architecture to expose the data, then the value of that data is completely dependent on how long some third-party proprietary owner of the standard associates with that data. Right? So if you put it into, say, a PDF format, then you are completely waiting on PDFs being available to further generations to make that data valuable. So going for open formats and considering it becomes valuable. The same principle is true within the airport. The architecture is itself very, very important when you build an open platform. Right? Again, if you imagine, I've actually flown on planes that could not stop by the gates that were automated because the height of the plane did not fit with the height at which the gate operated, and the gate was not variable in terms of the heights it represented. It just had a few levels it could work at. So then you have to park elsewhere, you have to get onto a bus. There are a series of inconveniences if the standards don't work. And that is not just a matter of the standard, but in terms of the planning. Do you actually have a gate to take in or take out the data that allows for these variable formats, that allows for this environment? The identity issue, while I mentioned before, is not trivial, because the only way any organization can correctly get away with exposing customer data is by making it the customer's choice. And therefore, unless you have some way of validating that the data that is being exposed is relevant to the particular customer in question, unless you had some way of validating the identity of that person in as many factors as the particular transaction type requires, you're not going to be able to do the service that you want. Simplicity and housekeeping are important. Again, when you take something as an airport, why I learn from airports is because many of the people in an airport, if you haven't noticed, don't actually speak the local language particularly well. So you need to be able to signpost to people without necessarily using words, because the language may not be enough. So you need graphic identifiers for what is being done. You need simplicity and convenience in the service that is being maintained in order to ensure that people who would not be part of your natural domain of expertise are able to consume the data. All this, if you actually look at the way an airport works, is actually because if you have the right standards, if you have the right approach in place, then you are able to do something which very few other organizations can do, which is to create an ecosystem of use of the services you provide. So again, if you take an airport, someone decided they would hold franchises for restaurants. Someone else decided they would bid for franchises for the duty-free, right? Airlines decided they would invest in departure lounges and in members' lounges. Somebody else felt that it was worth the community value of faith and worship rooms, or mother and baby rooms, or father and baby rooms. These choices are, as a community, evolves around the open platform, but the ways these things engage are different. Some are run by the airport authority, some are run by people who acquire a franchise, some are run by people who just rent something because they provide other services there. I've said all this to try and paint a picture of just what an open platform is like, without necessarily any specific reference to the civil service. What I have mentioned is the fact that data is important. And now I want to try and provide some context to that data. Data, as people may have found out even in this country with the time spent on analyzing MP expenses, for those who've had the time to do that, data, when made transparent, can have a whole series of effects. Sometimes it builds trust, sometimes it builds cynicism. It depends on whether the data that's exposed is either better than or worse than the expectation of what that data would represent. But why is data important in trying to rebuild the civil service in this form of shape? Well, I'm going to use some non-standard examples and talk about Google, eBay, Amazon, YouTube, Flickr. Okay? What people don't necessarily realize is that anybody can build another auction site. Okay? Building an auction site today is not particularly arduous. Right? The technology has got cheaper, the skills are more available. People can build another auction site like eBay. The reason it doesn't happen successfully is because eBay has a community of 200 million buyers and sellers with ratings. Okay? That's where the value really is, not in the auction system, but in the community with the ratings. And those ratings are not trivial to copy, right? They form competitive value because nobody else can get there quickly. The same is true when you look at Amazon. Anybody can build another book site, right? Building an electronic shop for books and even having access to a large inventory, it's not that difficult. But doing it in a way to have 9, 10 million reviews that people find useful, being able to collect the preferences and profiling, the recommendations that come through Amazon to say people who bought this also bought, right? So you have these improvements, these aids to your buying that are community-based, both in terms of ratings as well as in terms of reviews, and you get the collaborative filter of being able to say people who did this also did. Okay? That's where the value of Amazon is and why somebody would go there. It's not even necessarily a place where the best price is to be had, but it is a place where simplicity and convenience rule, and it is a place where the value is not necessarily in the software, but in the data. Okay? I'm not going to labor the point and take you through YouTube or Flickr. The point is simple. The value in many of the things that we build today is actually in the data that the customer uploads. Okay? We have to start seeing that the value is not in some centralized data that is collected. The people who actually contribute that data are customers in those cases. Well, the same may be true in many, many ways. Right? The nature of the contribution may be in some cases legal, like filings, drug trials, patents, whatever else. In certain cases, it may be environmental, where you actually crowdsource information to do with, one of the most fascinating studies that I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is finding out that people are taking old merchant ship logbooks and using the meticulous records in those logbooks in order to figure out something about the climate that existed at the time, because the best records of the climatic behavior were in those logbooks when there were no better ways of measuring it. Today, we have 4 or 5 billion devices called mobile phones which are capable of acting as sensors to be able to collect information. We can crowdsource a great deal of information. What the civil service has already in all its forms and guises, whether you look at education, whether you look at health, whether you look at welfare, whether you look at the meteorology or aeronautics, right down from bird strike data through patterns of dogs barking in local communities, right? Whether central or local, the capacity to be able not just to collect the data, but to make that data valuable is there already, but it won't be there unless there is a single collective sort of impetus to say, it makes sense for us to do this. We will open up the data. And in opening up the data, I tried to give you some rules as to just the principles of the architecture of the environment. But right now, I'm trying to concentrate on the fact that the value is in the data. Now, how many of you are familiar with Facebook? Okay, some, not a great deal of users, but again, I need to use examples to try and explain how some of these things work. With someone like Facebook, they have a developer platform, which is the sort of thing one would visualize to have in the civil service, to say there is some location or place where certain things are made available so that other people can build applications on top. But what Facebook does is say, identity of the people or individuals using the service has to be managed by Facebook. That's not a federated right that can be managed by everywhere else. So you have to sign up to Facebook in order to use a Facebook app. Similarly, the information about the relationships between people and their static data, the locations, are all also held within Facebook. So when you put up a Facebook page about who you are, your profile, your preferences, your interests, all that is held. And what Mark Zuckerberg termed the friend graph or the social graph that underlines it, which then shows the connections between the various people, which are also of value, these are things that Facebook retains and makes available to other applications, but only makes available. Nobody else can own that. Where you host the application you build is completely up to you. What application you build is completely up to you. What Facebook does is make a central platform available where certain core services are formed. Now, if you take the context of that and put it in where a civil service would operate, you start thinking, well, what are the things that you would like to hold centrally and not have anybody else do? Okay? One of the things that occurs when I've spoken to people is any form of geographical or mapping information. Because a lot of the value that gets created by the applications that consume data is in mashing one form of data with another, and one of the commonest mashups is location-based. If you can tie up information with the where of that information, if you can plot graphs of what is happening across a physical region, if you can associate a service with the environmental location it is. You know, you want to know an MP's voting patterns, right? An alphabetical list is much less meaningful than being able to plot it on a map. People like maps. People like location-based services. And, you know, the most ridiculously simple application I saw was actually of a council using the Google Maps support in order to locate where local dogs were barking as complaints, in order to figure out quickly whether it was one dog or two, because you could plot the locus of the complaints. Okay, but that's a trivial example. The point I'm trying to make is a lot of value can be generated for the citizen by making sure that the right to take data and map it is universal. Okay? There are other elements to that. The identity itself may be something where you could federate how it is brought, but the issuance of that identity may be something that needs to be centralized. And I speak in an environment calmly and relaxed as me, not as a senior exec of BT, in saying that there has to be scope for some form of identity issuance in the same way as right now there is a passport service, and I can't go get a passport from whoever I feel like. And there is a reason for that. So the ability to say that any form of citizenship acquires some form of identity, the social security number systems, the national insurance number systems, the tax numbers, all these things, in order to tie them up, some organization has to be accountable and responsible for the issuance and management of identity, which includes changes in that identity, as a Facebook would do. Births, marriages, deaths, all these things have to be accounted for and managed. Because in order for others to build services, you have to provide these core services. And when you provide the core services, what I've tried to do again is to give you the context in which making them free or open makes sense. This concept of private when open is not a trivial one, because the two terms of confidentiality and openness tend to compete with each other, and I don't even want to take a vote on what people thought about the recent MI6 incident. But what struck me was a conversation with a guy called Kenny Dalglish, who used to manage Liverpool Football Club in the late 80s. He sold a guy called Ian Rush to Juventus, and about a year later bought him back. And when he bought him back, one of the journalists talking to him said, "Mr. Dalglish, I don't understand this. Right? You sold Ian Rush to Juventus and nobody found out. You bought him back and nobody found out until your press release. How did you keep it a secret?" And Dalglish smiled on television and said, "Simple, I didn't tell anybody." Okay? If you really want to keep something a secret, the best way of doing it is not to tell anybody. The photographs of people misbehaving on Facebook are not the problem. Right? We've had photographs of them all the time. Right? When I was younger, it seemed to be that office parties had to have some association with someone drunk and a photocopier, okay? And then for a short period, those photographs would, create titters of amusement as they wandered around the office, and then people just forgot it. The problem with somewhere like Facebook is these things are then available for perpetuity. But I question the people who put that up, rather than saying that Facebook is wrong for it, because if there are things you do not want shared, then the best thing to do is not to put it in the open. So I'm not a buyer in that sense of saying that confidentiality means nothing is open. The trick and where the value comes is in making sure that if you build it with the right open architecture and you have the right controls in place, then only the people who have the right to see the data see it, as opposed to saying it's not going to be available at all, or that everything is going to be unfettered. Okay? There are a lot of good use cases, good examples of saying that a semantic web environment can create a lot of privacy tensions. Right? I have a pacemaker. Now, if that pacemaker would mean that I can't get insured in a particular way, which it does mean, right? If someone had sort of privileged access to that information and denied me some service, discriminated against me because of that privileged access without my knowing it, this is a big deal. Whereas if I declare that information out in the open and someone uses it, that's totally cool for me. The idea of the usage of that information is only when privileged access is there. A lot of people say, one of the stranger behaviors about privacy in the social world is, and this is happening more and more in offices, you'd walk somewhere and a bunch of people would be wishing somebody happy birthday. And the guy would turn around and look and say, but it's not my birthday. And then you find out it's his Facebook birthday. Because people have been taught to say, you don't give your birthday away because that date of birth is secret. It may be the way you unlock confidential data. Now, I think that's ridiculous because every day when I read the newspaper, there are a bunch of celebrities, a bunch of famous people of different forms or shapes of people with achievements whose birthdays are listed. Wikipedia lists over 100,000 birthdays if you try and just see how many records come up of extant people, of living people. So does that mean none of them has a right to privacy at all? No, the stupidity comes in using something as trivial as a date of birth as a security device. Okay? That's where the problem comes. So when we deal with opening up data, we need to know that if we build it the right way and we use the right security tokens, I signed up for Iris, okay? And people said, hey, hang on a second, JP, you're crazy. What if somebody steals the record of the way your iris looks? I said, yep. So somebody else is going to try to enter Britain, and he's going to have to look something like me to be able to do that. And he's going to bother to steal a record of my iris to do that. Well, I have no problem with someone else trying that because I know who I am and I can prove it. But if someone else said, your bank wants you to use your iris as a basis for withdrawing money, that's a different ballgame altogether. I wouldn't want to use a device like iris recognition to withdraw cash because that creates an incentive for somebody else to actually, maybe take my eyeballs out, replicate or clone the record. So when we deal with issues like this, we need to recognize first and foremost, if you want to keep something a secret, that's not something you're going to put in the open. There is no need to put something secret there. That's why the word secret means. And if you don't want to keep it a secret, and what you mean is it's confidential, and that it has relevance to be shared only with particular people in particular conditions, then technology is quite capable of doing that, and we have to architect systems that way. A lot of this depends on getting the static data right, and this is another piece of information which it may be that only a central service could perform or provide. And these are things like, town and city names and postcodes, various record identifiers for different types of people, even things like, E-codes or the additive identifiers, plain identifiers, because in order for us to be able to do anything with data, the metadata is critical, right? You have to know about what the data is. So you have to be able to associate the data that you're sending around with some form of identifier to say it's about this person, this location, this school, this drug, this anything. The label matters. And the ability to collect the metadata has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. And I'll give you two examples. One is photography. 30 years ago, an image was something that was analog. You took a photograph, and then you had to go somewhere to get it developed. When it got developed, the second pass, you would choose something to be printed and say, could I enlarge number 3, and could I have 4 copies of number 13? Okay, that's what you did. Then maybe 20 years ago, you had a camera that was capable of you're actually numbering it and maybe putting some words on it, and it had some primitive date and time facility. Usually the date and time was like the video recorders we had at home when we were young. They related to the date and time that was on when you bought it, because it was too much of a palaver to change it. So they sat on 1101 or whatever it is they came with. Today, again, I won't bore you with all the changes that have been made. Today, if you go to Flickr and look at the properties of a single photograph, you get something like 35 or 40 different properties you didn't even know you collected. It identifies the camera, the device itself, the focal length, the lens used, any filters used, the environmental conditions. It auto-date and timestamps. For more modern cameras, it even auto-geolocates. Okay? This is an incredible amount of information about something as trivial as a photograph, which is now collected without our having to worry. Right? The same is true for a lot of the data that you would get, because the cost of acquiring the metadata is dropping fast. You can auto-date and timestamp most things. You can auto-geolocate most things. You can associate almost any form of data that you pick up before you release it with a lot of context that you can capture and embed. If you move away from that to print, and you understand how that world changed, you will also see how you can build applications that change the way you expose data. 30 years ago, the world of print was also analog and a bit like image, multi-pass. You wrote something, somebody typeset it, came back with the proofs, you gave it back, and it was page set, it was made up into the book or magazine or whatever. It was an iterative process. And you never had the context of having your own local printer. You couldn't do things yourself, right? You had to go to somebody else's holy of holies to do anything. And then with the invention of the fax machine and the PC, when these two things got married, then the CCITT Group 3 and 4 standards, with the opening of what they call the AT bus on the PC, meant suddenly the personal printer was born. And they were primitive again in the mid-'80s, trying to find out where your document went, even though the printer was next to you, was interesting, because they would disappear in the ether or come out like complete gibberish. And today, you don't even think twice about print, okay? It's a little icon on a web page. It's a selection on your drop-down menu. Just to say, like, save or rename, it's print. These are the sort of things that are happening around us. Very, very simple things, but very powerful. To say metadata is getting cheap, the ability to embed something that used to be a silo is now a function in something else you're doing. But all of this, if you hark back to the Google or Amazon or eBay or YouTube or Flickr cases, is built around data. Okay? When you really understand just how much data the civil service, I tried before when I heard about this session and when I agreed to give it, I tried to think, maybe I've got a few weeks, I'm going to try and list all the sources of data. Okay? I gave up after the first couple of hundred, realizing there weren't even thousands, right? Data sources that you guys manage that are valuable to the public are in their tens, maybe even their hundreds of thousands. And that's just looking at current data without looking at the implications of archive data, all of which is immensely valuable. Okay? In order to think of examples of what to do with this, all I wanted to show you was a mirror, because the best examples are not going to come from me. The best examples are going to come from you. Because you know how the data that you acquire, that you process, that you hold, gets used and where the value comes. The key things to bear in mind are how that value is obtained is actually in releasing the data back to the individuals. I'll give you a very personal case of something that's not a government or civil service piece of data, but what changes would happen when someone like me has access to data. Okay? I collect books. I love books, and I have over 36,000 of them. I've somehow managed to avoid the divorce courts as I keep sort of putting the rest of the family out of house and home just in terms of the sheer number of books around. I now have something that looks like a porta cabin that's just full of it because it's the easiest way of my retaining the books. Now, when I've been buying the books, I've used Amazon amongst others. I've used Abe Books amongst others. And Amazon collect my behavior. They clickstream of my purchases. And then they start making recommendations based on what I've been buying and what they know I've bought. Now, wouldn't it be nice if I could actually have not just Amazon Stream, but Barnes & Noble Stream and Borders Stream, because my actual total number of purchases include the history of what I have plus my behaviors across these. So what Amazon knows about me is not actually complete. Therefore, the recommendations are not valid. This kind of understanding of how to manage your own profile gets important when, for example, I have 3 children, aged 23, 17, and 11. And sometimes the 11-year-old uses the same PC as I do, which means that I use Last.fm as a means of getting recommendations. And the recommendations start getting interesting when High School Musical is interspersed right in the middle of my late 60s, early 70s hippie folk rock. Right? The recommendation system has some challenges. So the ability to cleanse my clickstream to say, you know what, I didn't buy that book for me, so don't recommend anything. I bought that as a Christmas gift. I just happened to use Amazon. I didn't actually listen to that music. These sort of ways of being able to take the live stream that you have and edit it so that the service that comes back is valuable requires me to have access to my data. Now, Amazon may say, hang on a second, you didn't pay for it, it's not your data. But actually it is. It's neither theirs or mine. And the way to try to explain this thing about data ownership is, if you imagine that you have the personal mobile phone number of a close friend who doesn't give their phone number away to others. Even though it's in your address book, it's not actually yours. Right? You have that piece of information on trust from your friend. If a third party came to you and said, can I have that person's number? The reality is that you wouldn't give that unless you knew that the second party and the third party knew each other, and you knew that independently. Our own conventions, our norms, the ways we behave, means that we recognize that that information we hold of other people's numbers and contact information is privileged info. It is neither mine nor the other person's, but held in that sort of limbo to share only on when you know the conditions for sharing are right. Well, the same may be true of a lot of information that you collect. Right? I'm not here to sort of, the idea to me of giving a keynote was to open people up to thinking about the issues rather than concentrating on an individual application. One of the things to think about where, I have nothing against the HMRC, but like most people, I don't get a deep and peculiar pleasure in paying my taxes. Okay? The day, which is fast approaching for me now, I think sometime this month, when I've actually started working for myself, means something to me. Now, one of the ways of monetizing these services is actually to say that every time somebody makes a call on data, an API call in that context, there is a payment associated with it. And I can visualize the world when I see the sheer richness of data that is held, that genuine attempts can be made to defray the cost of running the state by monetizing things that are currently not available, but could be made available. So this is not just in the interests of transparency. There actually is solid, strong business value in being able to say the investment made in being able to take different data sources that are available to you, that are part and parcel of what happens every day, which are valuable to others, while keeping all the rules about open and accessible and non-proprietary and in machine-readable formats and confidential. And these are not complicated rules. They're very, very simple principles. But the value that comes in being able to say that you will allow individuals, units, regional locations, small companies, councils, you name it, all to figure out how they are going to use the data, because they know more about their business than you do, but you have tools that can make them much more productive than they are today. So the challenge I want to try and place before I open up for questions is to say that everyone everywhere is concentrating on opening up the civil service, meaning stuff to do with voting and attendance patterns in Parliament and the ability to go for legislation and use wikis for draft legislation, access to that. Well, everyone's doing it. And if I came along and I only spoke to you about what everyone's doing, why would you even bother to listen? Right? The value comes in saying there is a long tail of information that you guys hold that can be enriched at low cost, that you can actually transform. The UK can become the leading light in this trying to move right across the world, because the appetite is there. When I see what was happening at Reboot Britain yesterday, when I see the number of places where volunteers turn up because they want to participate in that exchange between the private and the public sector, right? There is an urgency, there is an enthusiasm, there's a willingness to do something that is out there. And the principles I'm trying to establish, just to summarize, are very simple. One, it's all about data. And the reference point are some of the most profitable companies in the Web 2.0 world right now. That data is valuable. When you have that data, it's important to recognize the things that you must control, because nobody else can. Giving somebody a monopoly right on it would actually be counterproductive. Looking to the state to provide it is the right thing. And there are many for which you can crowdsource the information. The collection of that data has got cheaper and cheaper, because metadata about much of what we collect is actually much easier to acquire, to retain, to store, to archive, to retrieve than has ever been the case before. Right? Google itself just shows you the sheer power of what archived information easily retrievable means compared to 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that value is there for us today. And this isn't just altruism. There is value even to the extent of monetization, because people who are going to make money by building applications on top of this and selling those applications as services to communities, to cities, even to countries, these are people who are quite capable of paying for the usage. The final thing I want to leave you with is, if this is done right, the entire model is shareable with other countries, other locations. Whether it's solutions within education, whether it's solutions in health, whether it's to do with being able to say that there is a meta model, a way of exposing the kind of data that's generated both centrally as well as crowdsourced, then everything to do with what I've spoken of is actually exportable to other places, because people will want to know how it is done. I think we stand at an amazing crossroads if we really capture what is possible, not in the high energy, use it to collect money, use it to change laws, use it to point out MPs' voting patterns and attendance patterns, right? That's the sort of, the low-hanging fruit that everyone will go after. I'm talking about a change of philosophy to say all the information is actually at the service of the citizen. It's the citizen's information in the first place. It doesn't exist without that, provided the right rules are established about the principles of making sure that the cost of repair is kept as low as the cost of damage or lower than, that confidentiality and privacy are correctly obtained, and that every single source of information that is collected is done in a way that is consistent with the 8 principles I was talking about, which you can review at leisure at resource.org. Thank you very much, and I'm now open for questions.
Thank you very much, JP. There are 2 mics in the room here. If you have any questions that you'd like to put to JP, if you just hold on 1 second and we'll bring the mic to you. Whirlwinds around. We will be putting JP's presentation, I'm tuning the speaker, up on the Civil Service Live website for any of your colleagues in IT or digital engagement or participation who might want to review it after today's event at all.
Similarly, if any of you has any questions later after you've thought about it, my email address was at the start. It's jobsworth@mac.com or jp@bt.com. And I'm be very happy to, this is a collective exercise. There's no proprietary value in any of it.
Hi, I'd like to know whether you've got any particular thoughts about the way that your talk applies to health information, people's personal health information, and what they expect to happen with the health service as a result of it.
Well, again, speaking as an individual rather than on behalf of, BT's sort of health department, my initial reactions would be that there is a lot of static data to do with the health service that building open standards for would be valuable. Even information like, the drug trial type info, the nature of what's coming on and off patent, the idea of generics. There's a lot of stuff that gets involved within the world of private, of sort of care for the individual, which can be made available. Information to do with the location of clinics, to do with registration of participants within the industry, whether it's doctors or whatever else, the primary care trusts. A lot of this is, again, information that can and should be made available. What can't be made available in quite the same form would be personal health records. Because then the risk of saying this person's had a heart attack, therefore, when he goes to eat a pizza, I need to raise his insurance policy. Right? Those sort of ACLU sort of sponsored, stated worries of what would happen when somebody misuses personal health information can be covered just by handling the privacy and confidentiality. Why should an insurance company be able to inspect my records? But I should be able to, if I want to, if somebody wants to write an application that says, I'm going to help you manage your own diet. So access to my medical information becomes valuable in order to work out a diet for me, but it's systematic, it's not done through human interaction, then elements of all my medical history become valuable in order to create references and recommendations for me through intermediary services. So on the one hand, you do not want to make that information available to the wrong people. On the other hand, it is valuable for third parties to be able to write applications, but they would be written with the permission of the patient in providing access to the records. In the same way as we do with saying, you go to a credit reference agency, when you're applying for something to do with credit, somebody says, I would like to check, and you give permission. So I can visualize a case where a lot of the information is made available, but only with the explicit permission of the patient, in order to provide services that are valuable to the patient. But if we said this is all secret, none of that innovation can take place. So I think there's incredible scope for innovation there, but through these 3 pieces. One, that there is static data that must be made available to all. There's confidential data that can only be made available with assent, and there should be some structure or basis for people to build applications using that assent that deliver value back to the patient. Does that make sense? Yeah, I can't give a deep answer here, my apologies, but if you give a more detailed context of the question, I'm happy to try and answer in more detail. Yes?
I think most of the examples you gave were pretty much from the private sector. I'm just interested because you talk, I mean, a lot of what you said makes absolute sense. It's kind of almost a classic kind of no-brainer. So the question really is, what do you think the cultural barriers are in organizations to making this happen?
Well, if you take someone like BT, right, we have to look at how, say, we use something like call detail records. Okay? There are lots of services we could perform, but it would mean that we have to break customer privacy to do it, so we don't do it. So the first cultural barrier we have to, I think, get to is understanding whose data it is. Right? We have to be very, very clear that in almost every case, the data that I'm talking about is some customer's data. Yeah, you have customers the same way as I have customers, and you have to at least accept in your heart of hearts that it isn't your data. Right? That is a big cultural leap for some people to make, because they're used to thinking it is their data. So whether it's the company or some element of the civil service, private or public sector, there has been a tendency to associate ownership of the data not with the citizen, not with the customer, but with the organization. Shifting from that is not trivial. One of the biggest changes to make. The second element is people tend to want to say, I know the answer, so I'm going to build the applications that are going to solve everybody else's problems. The willingness to say that the innovation is not going to take place except through partnering with other people who may have much better local domain knowledge, that's counterintuitive. So there's quite often a pushback to say, I know better. And the I know better is no different to me than the not invented here. So the willingness to actually say, we're going to invest in creating a platform that other people will use in order to create value for our customers is not easy for any organization, public or private, to counter and deal with. The third element, and the final element in that to me, is it isn't worth doing unless you have open standards. And particularly in the private sector, there's a lot of noise about proprietary elements to it because people feel defined by layers of lock-in. Okay? The right to exploit your customer is paramount in many people's minds. You use terms like customer relationship management when all three words seem out of place. Right? There is no relationship being managed, and you certainly don't feel like a customer if you're targeted and exploited and acquired and whatever else happens to customers. The same may be true for any consumer, any citizen. So those three barriers to say it's counterintuitive to say that it's not your data, it's counterintuitive to believe other people may know better what solves their problem, and that what you have needs to be shared. None of these is naturally part. People still think, we're talking about, the data word I use is fundamentally information. And a not sharing mindset says information is power. So you want to then hold on to those vestiges of power as much as you can. And that comes very much in the way of incredible innovation. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your patience and your time. I hope some ideas, some glimmer of or seed of some ideas came out as a result. Thank you.